carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and
The fact that John Smith lived to tell about his time in Virginia is a miracle in itself. He had to fight untrustworthy natives, he had to endure hunger, disease, hot summers, and frigid winters, but most of all, he had to maneuver himself around gentlemanly intrigue. He survived, and so too would England's New World presence as a direct result. But Virginia survived due also in large part to a fateful 1609 expedition, whose timely arrival ensured Virginia's permanence. John Smith returned to Jamestown after craftily escaping both Powhatan and Opechancano's clutches, but he wasn't safe. Powhatan, still upset with Smith's manner, coaxed 2 German workers into bringing a large stash of English weaponry. The workers were supposed to be building Powhatan an English-style house, but the prospect of death in Jamestown unnerved the builders. Powhatan understood this and promised to provide all their necessities. His plan worked, and the colony was thusly betrayed. Attempts by the young interpreter Richard Salvage and another unnamed settler to warn Jamestown were squelched by Powhatan. He caught wind of the messaging ploy and jailed the 2 would-be tattlers. The Germans, known to history as Adam and Franz, put their plan into motion when they met with Peter Wynne. Wynne was a councilman, and he had power to supply Adam and Franz's needs. The Germans told Wynne that Smith had commanded them to take weapons, tools, and clothing with them to work on Powhatan's new house. Wynne freely obliged. As many as 300 hatchets, 50 swords, 8 pikes, powder, and shot were carelessly handed over to the Germans, who then took their plunder along with half a dozen new converts back to Powhatan. Powhatan was gaining new bargaining power with which to destroy his erstwhile counterpart, John Smith. Smith also had other trouble much closer to home when Matthew Scrivener, his one-time ally and political puppet, had died. Scrivener, it seems, decided to vie for more power in the colony by setting out to Hog Island at the head of a 10-man crew that also included Richard Waldo, another council member. Their boat met trouble during a winter storm, capsized, and all men either drowned or died from hypothermia in the icy James River. Their deaths seriously hampered Smith's presidency and the colony as a direct result. Smith needed trustworthy men to aid his 2 Thessalonians 3:10 policy, especially since Newport's scant provisions were so rotten even the hogs wouldn't eat them. Regardless, Smith remained steadfast. If men didn't work, they wouldn't eat. He imposed a 6-hour workday and separated the remaining colonists into work groups in order to accomplish necessary tasks. He deemed the most current situation as untenable in that 30 to 40 honest and industrious men can't be expected to support 150 idle loiterers. In other words, he didn't have time for welfare. They'd all die if they didn't all work. The problem was that many of the early men who came to Jamestown came because they were seeking instant wealth. Smith's work didn't promise that desired abundance. Riches or not, Smith's work promised life. It's curious how foolish some people can be in that they'd rather die than work. While Smith had to ride the lazy majority, he still had to worry about increasing Indian hostility, especially because of the German workers' betrayal. But things seemed to take a turn for the better when 20 men discovered and sought to capture one of the traders outside of Jamestown's walls. Yet just as the Germans were being hunted, Smith happened upon the Paspaheag chieftain Wawinchepunk. Both men tried to shoot the other, though their weapons jammed. Then Wawinchepunk latched onto Smith and dragged him into the James River in order to drown the Englishmen. They continued wrestling long enough for Smith's men to begin lining the shore, which unnerved the Paspahegh and allowed Smith an opportunity to quickly end the fight by snatching Wawinchupunk's hair and then grabbing his throat. Wawinchupunk became Smith's prisoner in the end, and he divulged information that Powhatan was behind the sudden attack. He wanted Smith dead. But before Smith could decide what to do next, the chief escaped and fled back to his people. Wawinchupunk's escape forced Smith's next move in that Smith understood that the Indians would think him to be weak if a retaliatory attack were not levied. Smith certainly didn't want to appear weak, so the English swiftly attacked the Paspaheghs, killing a handful, stealing fishing traps, and lighting some homes ablaze. The quick skirmish ended when Wawinchupunk, suffering the loss, messaged Smith for a meeting in which the Paspaheghs promised to share some food. The alternative was that, in spite of Smith's successful attack, the English would lose in the long run, because the natives would just leave the land and therefore all food trading behind. Smith realized he was walking a fine line, as his violence was both helping and harming the colony. Regardless, Jamestown survived into the spring. Smith's methods, perhaps questionable outside of the fort, were unquestionably working within the settlement. During this time, a well was also dug within the fort that supplied fresh drinking water, as opposed to the colonists drinking brackish water, hitherto being drunk. Further, 20 houses were rebuilt after the earlier devastating winter fire. The church also was rebuilt, much to Robert Hunt's delight, though he would not hold too many services therein, if at all. Hunt died during early 1608 and was buried within the newly built church's chancel, which was confirmed by the 2015 discovery of his, as well as 3 other notable graves by the Preservation Virginia archaeologists. Hunt's death was certainly a blow. He was the one man who seemingly tamed the many violently passionate temperaments that governed Jamestown. Smith may not have realized it at the time, but without Reverend Hunt, he would not have been able to keep Jamestown's higher-ranking citizens calm. Even if Smith did realize the gravity of Hunt's loss, he didn't have time to dwell on it. Food had to be found. The colonists quickly set up the stolen Paspahegh fishing weirs and began catching James River sturgeon. Smith also had a blockhouse built in order to reestablish trade between English and Indian traders. Work also continued to expand into tar, pitch, glass, and potash production, as Smith hoped the colony leaders would understand that Jamestown had other things to offer than finding the elusive gold mine or two. Still, in spite of the advancements being made, Smith had to submit under reality. He did not have enough to feed all of his men for much longer. That being the case, he undertook a brilliant program that involved sending 60 men downriver under George Percy in order to live off of fish and oysters. 20 to 30 more went out to Point Comfort to attempt the same action, while another 20 men went northward to the James River Falls at today's Richmond. The move would have worked, but in each case poor management and severe backbiting plagued all but one of the survival ventures. Mutiny was once again in the air. Smith would have none of it, however, and he let it be known that anyone attempting to flee would swiftly be punished by hanging on the gallows. Now would have been a good time for Robert Hunt's wisdom, but he was gone. Smith was on his own, not only in Virginia, but also in England. The Virginia Company leaders were beside themselves with anger. Where was the gold? What about the Northwest Passage, or the lost colonists? It's been 2 years, and all that can be shown for it is backbiting and loss. Christopher Newport's January 1609 arrival did nothing to assuage the Virginia Company's fears. His return only confirmed failure. Newport delivered John Smith's critical 1608 letter, which hammered the colony's leadership to that point. But Newport also brought Gabriel Archer and John Ratcliffe, who met with the company's directors. They ripped into the upstart by blaming him for all of the colony's failures. After enduring sniping comments, Thomas Smythe and his fellow directors decided that John Smith was not to blame, and that he was indeed correct. Change was needed. The company agreed to restructure their effort by sending a solid flow of fresh settlers, the type of settlers that John Smith requested. Smythe had to request a new charter, which was approved in February 1609. This charter was broader than the first. The goal was to establish a permanent colony, and to do so, Smythe asked for more control. King James granted that control and essentially removed any influence over the governing body that he may have previously had. Thus, a larger council of 50 members was established, in which men like Francis Bacon, Lord Delaware, Edwin Sandys, the Earl of Southampton, William Shakespeare's patron, were involved. These men, though 3,000 miles away, were now the absolute authority in Virginia. The new council reviewed the then current situation and decided that a new governor was needed, and it wasn't going to be John Smith. The new council wanted one able and absolute governor, who was unquestionably the vested authority. He'd still have a local governing council, but they'd have no influential power other than advisement. The new charter didn't just affect local government, it also affected geography. Virginia's boundaries were extended a further 200 miles north and 200 miles south of Point Comfort. Jamestown itself was affected in that it was to no longer be the seat of power. 3 additional settlements were planned, and they would gain Jamestown's former authority. This was done because the new laws stipulated that private land ownership was now being extended to new settlers. The company wanted to spread out and inhabit territory, much to Powhatan and his followers' chagrin. But though private property was now woven into Virginia's legal framework, there still remained a nagging touch of central planning. The company still deemed it wise protocol to have a common storehouse from which everyone would be fed. To ensure that the storehouse would be stocked, a type of military control through conscription was to be enforced. That same militia would also oversee devout religious devotion to the Anglican Church. No Catholic was to be allowed passage to the New World, and if any were found, penalties would be swiftly enacted ranging from expulsion to potentially death. Finally, the new charter called for more settlers. In order to sponsor the increase, more investors were needed, so the company restructured its base in a joint stock venture that extended to the less wealthy. The idea was that more investors would be able to shoulder the burden of sending and supplying more settlers. A series of expeditions were planned which would bring hundreds of new faces into the struggling colony. To lead those new ventures, the company centered its attention on Sir Thomas West, Lord Delaware, and Sir Thomas Gates. Both men were quite experienced travelers. Delaware fought the Spanish in the Netherlands, defeated the Irish in Ireland, for which he was benighted, then saw his rising star fall by being caught up with the Essex Rebellion in 1601. His relative, Queen Elizabeth, eventually pardoned him and gave him a new position on her Privy Council. After King James rose to power, Delaware was kept on that council. It was during this time that the New World fervor was reaching new heights, and Delaware was one who stoked the growing flames. That being the case, he was in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the Virginia challenge. Thomas Gates also served England for many years. He was an ambassador to Vienna, fought in both the West Indies as well as in the Netherlands, before asking to be sent to Virginia. He had ambition. He had to. He was not only an adventurer, but he was also an original investor. That being the case, it was reasoned that Gates had a lot to lose, so he was chosen to lead the initial 1609 expedition, and he'd act as interim governor until Delaware was able to cross the Atlantic. John Smith didn't know it at the time, but he officially lost power in February 1609. The thing was, that turnover would not occur until the newly chosen governor arrived on the scene, and that is where the story becomes really interesting. Once the charter was finalized, the company set about popularizing the latest Virginia mission. News spread through churches, governmental offices, official publications, and word of mouth. Now under the new rules, many more could invest, many more could cross the Atlantic, many more could strike it rich, or establish a new life. Or die, what's the difference? This was a stirring for God, gold, and country advertising campaign, and it worked. But it was based upon a lie. Virginia was not paradise. It was not lined with gold, and it was not full of wildly growing crops. Sure, it had potential, but that potential would only be realized through hard work in the severest of conditions. The colonists coming to Virginia were unprepared at best for what was about to befall them. They were promised the Garden of Eden by preachers like William Simmons. They would have food, clothing, houses, and a share in the wealth. There was room for everyone. Everyone, including those who were unwanted back in England. Why not send the poor, idle, and orphaned? It would be a way to clean up the streets while possibly making the vagrants rich. Or, well, make the vagrants work for the rich while offering prizes after indentured servitude. The campaign to raise funds as well as new settlers was a success. It was such a success that the Spanish ambassador Pedro Zuniga took notice and began sending word back to his royal boss in Spain. More than 600 purchased shares in the Virginia Company's new offering, many of whom risked their lives by backing the venture. Some 600 more decided to pack up and move to Virginia in 1609. This, more than anything, caused Zuniga great alarm. He sent increasingly urgent messages to Philip III warning the Spanish king that the English had designs against Spanish interests. He was right, but Jamestown would not rival the Spanish Main for quite some time. That being the case, Zuniga wanted to destroy Jamestown now, while it was still in infancy. Philip listened and perhaps thought to act, but did not. Philip's indolence concerning English expansion was certainly among his greatest mistakes. Had the Spanish attacked at this very moment, Jamestown would certainly have been lost. As it were, the voyage that embarked in May 1609 would become the stuff of legend. It endured hardships like none other, survived, as we shall see, and arrived just in time to establish Virginia's permanence. Thank you for your continued support of the Virginia History Podcast. If you like what is being produced, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcast provider. Like us on Facebook and visit the website at vahistorypodcast.com. Please share the program as well as rating the podcast on iTunes and offering any feedback that you may have. Also, consider contributing to the podcast Patreon campaign in order to fund future research and episodes. Visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHISPod. One can also find a link to the campaign under the Support tab on the website. I'm also creating a podcast store where at present I am creating a library of Virginia photography, so perhaps you are not able to support the podcast on a monthly basis, but a single purchase can be done. Links will be in the show notes page. Finally, thank you to those who have provided me with valuable comments. They're greatly appreciated. Please, keep them coming. Join me next time as we begin wrapping up our look at John Smith's leadership, as well as begin explaining how Virginia was saved by way of Bermuda.
Mas tudo bate despedido dos embazes.